He is faithful to God. We don't find any evidence of complaining. But yet, something very bad begins to brew. The master, Potiphar, who is an officer of Pharaoh's wife, gets the hots for Joseph. She wants to commit adultery. She begins to come to him not once, but daily, the Bible says. And I love the way this young man fears God. Every day he says, no, no, no. Finally, she catches him by the robe one day when they're alone in the house. She said, lie with me. Nobody will know it. We're alone. He said, God forbid I sin against God and your husband. And he does what the Bible says. He flees sexual immorality. He is an obedient young man. I mean, listen, folks, no church, no brethren, nobody to fellowship with for 10 years, and yet he's still obeying God like this. I love the way this man fears God. He runs from sexual immorality. The robe tears. He runs out of the house naked. She's a scorned woman, and she screams rape. Now, the very thing he's fleeing from, he gets thrown into the dungeon for. Now he is thrown into the dungeon, and let me tell you, Pharaoh's dungeons are so much worse than our prisons today. Our prisons could be compared like country clubs to Pharaoh's dungeon. He's in that dungeon for over 2 years, yet we still don't find any evidence of complaining. Do you see how godly this young man is? Are you with me? He's in the dungeon, and Pharaoh has 2 men, a butler and a baker, that are sent to prison. Both of these men have a dream. And in their dream, God shows them specific things about themselves. They wake up very afraid about it. Joseph interprets by the Spirit of God their dreams. And exactly what he interpreted came to pass. The butler was restored. The baker lost his head. All right? Later, God gives Pharaoh a dream. Now here's where it starts getting good, and pay attention. This is where it really gets interesting. A little bit after this, God gives Pharaoh a dream. Pharaoh is troubled by this dream. None of his magicians can interpret it. But the butler says, I remember this Hebrew boy in the dungeon. He interpreted my dream, and it came to pass. Pharaoh said, make haste and bring him here. They bring Joseph before Pharaoh. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream. He says to Pharaoh, God has given you this dream, and God is showing you what's about to come on the earth. There's going to be 7 years of great harvest, and then there's going to be 7 years of famine. Pharaoh listens to Joseph. He realizes this is the interpretation. And then Joseph says to Pharaoh, this is what you must do. Store up the grain. God is showing you this because you should store up the grain so that when the 7 years of famine come, you will have enough, not only for you, but for others. Pharaoh loves it. He makes Joseph the number 2 in command. The nation and the world goes through 7 years of great harvest. Now listen carefully. The famine begins, and when the famine begins, because the only one who had knowledge of the famine was Pharaoh, now all the nations of the world have to come to Pharaoh to buy grain. Jacob, or Israel, who is godly, who is Moses' grandson, who is the covenant man of God, doesn't know the famine's coming. God didn't give the dream to Jacob. He gave the dream to Pharaoh because it was his way of doing 2 things. Number 1, making Egypt the most wealthy, powerful nation in the world. And number 2, causing Jacob to come to Pharaoh to have to buy. Because that would be the vehicle he would get Abraham's grandson or grandchildren underneath Pharaoh's rule. Are you seeing this? Now, God makes Egypt the most powerful nation because all the nations are having to buy from them. Now, eventually, 2 years into the famine, Jacob has to send his sons to Pharaoh to buy bread. When they come, they meet up with Joseph. Joseph recognizes them, but they have no idea it's Joseph. After 2 meetings, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. When he does, his brothers are horrified because they think he's going to kill us. I want you to go to Genesis 45, and I want to show you something. Look at verse 4. This is when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. Genesis 45, verse 4. And Joseph said to his brothers, watch this, please come near me. So they came near. Then he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Notice he said, God sent me. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. Now look at verse 7. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. Now, you think, all right, the guy's deranged. The dungeon obviously got to him. He's been out of church for too long. What do you mean God sent him there? Joseph was the most godly of all 12 sons. Do you mean to tell me that God would actually not only allow but plan Joseph to go through all that suffering of slavery for 10 years and then a dungeon for over 2 years? Well, let's see what the psalmist said. I'm going to read to you what Psalms 105 verses 16 through 19 says. Moreover, God called, now listen carefully, God called for a famine in the land. Who called for a famine? He destroyed all the provisions of bread. He did it for a reason. He wanted to make Egypt the wealthiest nation in the world. God sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. Now listen carefully. They hurt his feet with fetters. He was laid in irons until the time that his word came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. Notice he was hurt with fetters and chains. Notice it was God who sent him. Now, folks, I've heard a lot of people try to walk around that one, but when I've got two witnesses, the psalmist and Joseph, both saying that God did it, I'm going to have to believe it. Are you with me? Now, why would God allow this godly young man to go through such suffering at the hands of authority? Well, there's a reason in this. If you go to Exodus, the 9th chapter, go with me there and we're going to see it. Exodus 9:16 says, this is the word of the Lord from Moses' mouth. But indeed, for this very purpose, everybody say, for this very purpose, I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. Folks, look up at me. Up to that point, the only ones who knew who God was Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants. What is the thing that Moses said to God when God said, go command Pharaoh to let my people go? Moses said, who shall I say sent me?